Good afternoon. This is Al Black and Tim Conroy with Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat. Our guest today is author, poet, wildlife biologist J. Drew Lanham. He's a native of Edgefield, South Carolina. He's the author of an award-winning book, The Home Place, Memoirs of a Colored Man's Love Affair with Nature, which received the Reed Award for the Southern Environmental Law Center and the Southern Book Prize, and was a finalist for the John Burroughs Medal. Drew is also the Poet Laureate of Edgefield County here in South Carolina. He's a birder, a naturalist, and a hunter conservationist who has published essays and poetry in publications including Orion, The Audubon, Flycatcher, and Wilderness, and is in several other anthologies. We are happy to have him. He has a collection of poetry also titled Sparrow Envy. He's an alumni distinguished professor of wildlife ecology and a master teacher at Clemson University. Welcome, Drew.
Hey, Al, how are you?
Hey, wonderful.
Hey, Tim, how are you?
Great.
Good to be here with you guys, or there. Here, there. I guess we're everywhere, right?
Yes, this is virtual. It has forced us into doing something that we had talked about for a long time. And now, because we can't go anywhere, Tim and I started this, and we're really happy with some of the things that are happening. And we expect to eventually have recorded interviews with poets in all 50 states and some other countries. So we're happy to have you.
Well, I'm honored to be in the number, as my grandmother used to say, just one more time, you know. But it's an important time, I think, to stay connected however we can. So, you know, if tension breeds verse, then there's a lot of it flowing these days, man.
Wonderful. It's obvious your life as a naturalist and ornithologist informs your poetry. How does your poetry impact your life as a naturalist and ornithologist?
Wow, good question. You know, I think, really, I think about birds and words. You know, as part of my job, I have to identify birds. I have to understand how they interact with the world. And so that ecological interplay, for me, there's a rhythm to it. And you know, sometimes there's meter, but mostly it's free verse, the way that that wild things interact with one another and with the world. So, you know, I think in verse, and I'll have my students try to think that way. I don't know, Al and Tim. I think it just sort of happened for me in that, you know, I would learn bird songs, and I would sort of reduce birds to the fewest number of factors. So one of the exercises that I'll have my students do is, and I know you love haiku, Al, I'll have students, they've got 17 syllables to describe a bird. And that makes them focus in a different way. And I'm not super critical, you know, if they are if they miss the count, but what I want them to do is to think about the words that describe what they see, or even better, I want the words to describe to what they feel. So it's been sort of an ongoing thing for me to think in verse and to think about birds as poems. And one of my favorite songs of all times, favorite albums, The Ecology, and the namesake tune from that, I play that for my class. and I have the students read those lyrics from Marvin Gaye, and they're still appropriate today. And that's the way good, you know, if you throw good words, they last. And somebody did. I can't remember whether whether Marvin wrote that or not, but that's part of my motivation, to have words that last, and that hopefully inspire people to think in different ways about nature beyond some field guide.
You know, Drew, I love that response. I'm thinking about your poem, A Dream of Swans, you know, and really the Wren poem that you wrote, so great. Let me ask you, what makes a good poem for you? What are the qualities makes a good poem, and what is your process for writing a poem?
You know, I feel in some ways, Tim, like I still feel like a newbie as a poet, and I think that's a healthy thing. I mean, I know there are folks who are established and ensconced, and you know, they live that life. I think being a poet is a practice. I don't believe that any poem is ever really finished, and I've heard painters talk about that, that, you know, there's never really any final brushstroke or anything like that to finish. It just sort of rests where it is for a while, and if you're lucky, sometimes you get to go back and play at it. So to me, a good poem is raw. I can feel the moment in that poem. I really don't want to feel the edits. I even though I know that there are poems that people work on for years or decades, I still want to feel the elemental flush of that poem. What that first feeling was when that poem was thought, when it was felt. And I think poems, to me, poems are felt more than a long essay can be, prose can be, certainly, you know, we can bend prose towards poetry, but I like to feel poetry. You know, when people ship something to me and they say, yeah, you know, this is just fresh off, you know, my heart, man, I dig that, because that means you haven't had time to go back and rethink what you were feeling. That at the time, whether it was good or bad, and even if the words aren't just right, that's what you put out there. So I'm always wondering what first versions look like in a poem.
And I think that's great. That's a great thing to look at. Sometimes as a poet, I over edit and I kill that spark. And I think that's the worry. And that's why I think I try to save all the revisions so I can usually go back to the early revision where I haven't ruined the poem. But I'm wondering if you could bring us into a little emotions of your poetry and read a couple selections for us.
Okay. I think, you know, you mentioned A Dream of Swans, and I think that's a good one to start with, and that's from the Sparrow Envy, chapbook. A Dream of Swans. I saw their pale feathered flying forms through the glow of a waxing bay moon. I could feel their wild hearts' murmurings. I longed as they did for other places far away but close to heart. I took flight in that swan dream. I took flight and sailed with kindred spirits over salt marsh and fallow field. The earth, landscape sprawled in space and flattened in time, passed beneath the folding and unfolding of my wings. I was of it all and yet not a part of any that was. I murmured too. I murmured a sweet and sad swan song, whispering in the way that wild winged things do of wanderings and wanting and wishing for the felt but unseen. In my dream flight, my wings whooshed and my voice murmured, but my swan soul moaned, and the peeping frogs peeped from their ponds, and the tide rose and fell on the ocean's swell, because desire deemed it so. In that swan dream, as I flew across the waxing bay moon, my breast ached with strokes urgent rode against imagined sky, and yet when I woke, I found that I did not fly.
That's gorgeous. Did I hear my swan soul moaned and the peeping frogs peeped? That's just a gorgeous line.
Thank you. Thank you.
And the repetition of a lot of W sounds really kind of gives it the flow of water.
Al, that's something that, I don't know, in that practice, there's this thing, and alliteration is, I fall into it too much frequently, and I'm not sure why. There's some switch in my brain that does that. Sometimes it works. And here, I think with the W's, it got past my editor, John Lane, and made it in, but I think the alliteration sometimes worked. When I read it, I want to be able to feel it, but sometimes I also want the words to form the rhythm. That was a poem that really wasn't lined in any way. It was just sort of a paragraph that I threw out there. And so I'm not really good at lineation. I try to play with it. I know people do some fancy stuff with it. Al, you had a great poem out there that you threw up on Facebook the other day that really dealt with ideas of prejudice and privilege. And the way that you lined that out, the way that you hung those words meant something. And, I want to learn that. That's part of the practice. So, I study other poets and how they throw stuff out there. But yeah, alliteration is one of, it's fun to play with sometimes, but sometimes I'll fall into, abusing it. But I'm glad it worked for you there.
Well, I thought the way your form worked, Drew, when I saw the poem in print, was like a wall of swan sound. And that's how I looked at your form. I thought it was perfect for that.
Thanks, Tim. It's one of the things that I've always wanted to do, and I think as a writer in general, man, poetry is so hard because it can be so raw, and because many of us are just sort of painting from that first smack of what it is that we see or feel or hear, in this case with swans. And so I was overwhelmed when I saw those birds. I was up actually in Maryland, on the eastern shore of Maryland, and and we see swans here down in the low country, down in the Yates Basin, and you see those swans, and if you're lucky, you see a few dozen. Well, up there, I was seeing tens of thousands, and the sound was overwhelming. But then one night, actually hearing them fly in the night, and it was a full moon, and hearing the pinioning of those wings, it was I'll never forget it. So when I read a poem that I've written, I want to be able to relive where that poem came from, and I can do that with Dreaming of Swans.
Hey, Drew, before we go on for Al to ask you the next question, would you read one more for us?
Sure. I think, there's when I think about this book, this chapbook, and how it came to be. So much of this came to be through social media, and so I it's a special book to me because I think that poetry is meant to be shared. So with migration going on right now, and us sitting in the backyard, me sitting in the backyard birding, I wanted to read a poem called Migration. Migration. What thoughts ramble in the redstart's brain as the day draws close, as dusk descends? Is it wormy fuel to lay on fat, a steady southbound wind? Perhaps it's the flicker of unseen light, the lure of tropical terrain. Is it the plan to be hardwired, to have instinct etched in by design not likely to change? Or does some warbler learned plan B come into play by circumstance rearrange? Fare thee well, little bird. May stars bright guide you true to thicket lush, past falcons rush through dark skies inky blue. It's my hope that neither cat nor glass will spell your odyssey's end, but that your tiny wings, some luck, some skill will bring you back to inspire me once again. So, that one, a little bit of iambic flows into that. But I was sitting inside one day and heard this little chip note out back, and I went, and there's this little redstart, this tiny warbler in the bird bath, and this thing had just dropped out of the sky, somehow found my yard, and, it could have been it was headed actually south. This was fall migration. And I was overwhelmed by that one little bird's intrepid journey to write that poem. So sometimes it's less than a bird, sometimes it's a feather. So, but that one is appropriate for this time of year with things on the move.
Yeah, listening to you right now is inspiring me with some ideas to write myself. I'm sitting here with a notebook to steal. Were you always interested in poetry, or did this interest develop later? And within that, who are your poetry influences, as well as being now the poet laureate of Edgefield? How does this all swirl around that?
Yeah, I have always been interested in poetry. I think, as a kid, when the teachers in junior high and in high school would assign poetry readings, I didn't mind them. I mean, I wasn't a Henry Wordsworth Longfellow fan, but I loved Robert Frost. I could, like many people, I guess I could feel Robert Frost in different ways. But I think, and I didn't mind Shakespeare. I didn't mind sonnets, sort of trying to decipher them. It was a challenge to me, and so I even tried writing one or two of them. But really, the big influence as a poet comes from someone who people would probably never consider a poet. Really, Aldo Leopold. I love lyrical prose. I love lyric prose, and so the way that he wrote it, it seemed to me that he as a naturalist, he had the sensibility of a poet. That he knew in the essays that he wrote, that a line could carry that essay to the next line and to the next line. And so I always thought about Leopold as a poet, and I would love to go back and look in some of his archives to see if he ever made attempts at poetry proper. But to have someone's prose flow, that influenced me, man. I dug that. And so Leopold was an important figure for me because he was that blend of naturalist and that poetic sensibility. So that's sort of where I fell there. And really, Rachel Carson, kind of did the same thing in the way that she wrote. Everybody thinks about Silent Spring, but Under the Sea Wind, and even listening I love listening to books on tape, and hearing others read gives me a sense for sort of where they are. And I think a lot of people would admit to having a love of poetry, but sometimes not being successful in publishing it, they go forward. So, those two are great influences sort of on the prose side. I was always in love with Langston Hughes, and as a black man, he was important to me, and really one of the first people that opened the door for me. And so in high school, it was one of the few black poets that we were exposed to. Now really as a nature poet, it goes without saying that, so many of us have been influenced by Mary Oliver. I love the simplicity of her poetry. I love the lack of pretense in it. I don't like stilted poetry very much. I like for poetry to, and I'm gonna make sure that I'm plugged in here so that I don't get lost. But I like the idea of a poet being real, and so I feel that with her verse. I don't know her. I know people who knew her. I love the idea of looking back behind a poet's life and understanding who they were, and being able to read their verse and say, oh yeah, I see that, I get that. So, those were some major influences for me, and being the poet laureate of Edgefield, I have to, and Laurel Blossom technically was the first, and Laurel, I had a chance to meet her and have read a lot of her work and really love what she did for Edgefield. But one of the first things that I did in my ceremony was that I asked that we consider Dave, the Potter, the poet laureate of Edgefield, the first poet laureate. Because that man who is held as chattel property dared to be literate, So writing your name was a dare, and he wrote more than that. So he's an inspiration because, he's from my home ground. He's of that red miry clay in Edgefield. And so I think a lot about him when he was throwing clay, when he was throwing pots, what was inspiring him? What was really encouraging him to do something that at any moment somebody could just decide that they didn't like it and take his life for it? So those kinds of things are important to me.
Dove, that really is a good answer for this question I'm about to ask, and this I'm going to follow up a little bit. In terms of your poetry, how does culture, beliefs, interests, faith, what you've learned? How does it all influence your poetry? And what are the sort of cautions that you can talk to the emerging writer about how to use and harness those things best in writing?
Man, you know, all of it, if it's working right, every last bit of me is in it. You know, if it's working right, then every last bit of me, from, you know, walking barefoot on dirt roads back on Route 1, Box 29, Edgefield, South Carolina, to, you know, to a PhD, to, you know, it all comes together in the best work. So, you know, what I try to do, Tim, really is when I think of a poem. Last night, of course, you know, we've got this beautiful moon rising, this waxing to full, and I had just spent a good portion of the afternoon and the evening watching birds. And I was thinking about these birds and whether or not they would be with me tomorrow, whether or not I would see them. So I'm looking at the moon and I'm taking pictures of the moon, and the poem started, we rise, we wax and wane, and then it just sort of went from there, and then it was sort of this transcendent thing, and I started thinking about birds, and I started thinking about birds migrating at night as we sleep, and all that they've got to go through, and that really birds are going through these passages that many of my ancestors went through, these middle passages where they are, you know, are going through these trials, and the birds at least are free. And so, you know, I can rejoice in that. But then in our current situation of being distant, I wanted to reflect somehow in that poem that even though we are far away sometimes from friends and loved ones and family, that it's the best thing for us now, and that birds can transcend the distance by song and by these inspiring journeys. So, you know, that was a little piece that I wrote last night, and I don't know, in thinking about it, probably 20 minutes, that had almost everything I had thought about during the day in it. So a lot of times my poems, I journal in verse. I'm not a good journaler. I don't sit and write, you know, I did this at 9:45 and at 9:48 I did that. I'm just not disciplined enough to do that. So at the end of the day, when I write most of my poems, they're really sort of, you know, allegorical to the day and what I've been thinking about and what's been on my mind.
And that's a great answer, and that's a lot to think about. And I really appreciate that, Drew. Brother Al.
Well, you know, one more thing, guys, if you don't mind. I think, you know, you ask about the emerging writer. I would always tell them not to hold back. You know, you can play games with yourself. Now, there are times as a poet that I write things between the lines that aren't written, but I'm trying to say. I would encourage emerging writers to not overthink your poetry. I talk about editing, and editing happens, but man, cut it loose. You know, I think that's what poets have, I think, poetry has over long form oftentimes, is that if you cut it loose, people get to feel you and understand you in a very different way.
That's kind of leads into this next question. And then as you answer this question, if you want to read a couple poems to end up the day, it would be wonderful. And my question is, for you is, as you dig into craft, how do you paint with words? And what are the poetic elements you tend to use, whether it's metaphor rhythm, alliteration, that kind of thing. And is
Yeah.
it a product of intention or a product of flow?
Wow, man, that's a dissertation right there, Al. Um, you know, it's intentional flow. Um, you know, I want to I want people to feel what I'm feeling. You know, I think the if a poet can evoke empathy, you know, I really don't want people to read my poems and say, "Oh, I'm so sad for him," or "I'm happy for him," or I want them to say, "Oh my God, geez, that got me. I felt, you know, I'm there." I don't necessarily want them to think about me. I really don't. And if they're thinking about me when that poem drops, then I haven't done a good enough job to move past sympathy to empathy. So that flow and trying to choose words carefully, ultimately, we all love words, but understanding sometimes that that too much alliteration distracts. That if I fall into some sort of you know, iambic pentameter, that suddenly it sounds like it's played, right? But then if I try somehow, that if I'm working with lineation and it's too far out there, and it's just like, oh, I'm just going to throw this one word out to the right margin because I can, and somebody says, wait a minute, why? You know, I got lost there. Then it hasn't worked. So, you know, that intentional flow, sometimes I want people to see, you know, man, when I wrote that, and I write 90% of my poems on my phone, that when I was writing that on Evernote or wherever, this is how it came out. And, you know, if a semicolon's misplaced or an M dash, or there's no punctuation at all, which I'm tending towards, then I want the words and that flow to have stopped. I've been working on this collection of poems that I call breathless, and they're poems for, they're what I call exhale poems. You take a breath, and you ought to be able to read that poem in one breath. And I'm sure there's some fancy name for the form, but it's important for me in those poems. One of the poems I wrote about a mayfly, and because a mayfly's life is so brief, it's so ephemeral, I wanted those few words to reflect in one breath, one life. So that intentional flow from a breathless poem to a poem I wrote about barbecue in Edgefield, South Carolina, that's in 3 parts. It's a meat and 3, I call it. You know, the flow there, I want that flow to be through centuries, that people understand from, you know, the history of enslavement in America, where I'm going. I want them to understand from this guy named Eugene Pickens, who was smoking pigs in Edgefield, South Carolina, back during the time of Pitchfork Ben. I want people to understand from Eugene Pickens up through Maurice Bessinger and Piggy Park Barbecue, and why you shouldn't eat there. Sorry. But I remember, you know, but all that came from this Atlantic article, I believe it was, where this woman was writing about barbecue, and she wrote something about Eugene Pickens, and then she wrote a little bit about Piggy Park. But I wanted people to understand how, you know, hell, I stopped at that place one time when I was young, not understanding where I was. And it's always stuck with me. So sometimes the intention is flow through centuries. You know, I want people to think about, you know, tomato-based sauce versus vinegar pepper versus mustard-based. So, you know, the mechanisms that I try to use are relevance. I don't want anything, if that can be a mechanism, I don't want stuff to be so far flung that people say, what was he doing? I don't know anything about that. Even if they don't know the names of birds, that to understand the journey of a bird, something that weighs no more than a handful of paper clips, that you see it, you may not know the name of it, but you have some idea that this one life that's lived, that's in your backyard, is an extraordinary life. So I don't know if that gets at the question or not, but.
Can you share one poem with us to close the interview?
Yeah, I think I want to share a poem that I wrote back in November of this year, and it's called For Lindsay on Real Lynching. Looking skyward, squinting through leaves filtering June sun through new green, trying to pin names on singing birds above, I sometimes wonder whether there are trees here that someone might hang me from. Whether these were forests where guttural moans echoed off hollowed bald cypress, where sobbing cries for mercy fell soft on sodden, litter-carpeted ground, where maybe, hopefully, in some final defiant hell-sending curses thrown from the mouths of those God himself abandoned, tamped down Bart Owl's dusk-hooting refrain. I ponder between spells of warbler identification in the midst of sorting one chip note from the other, parsing hooded soft pips from more emphatic sips of black-throated blues. What drove the sylvatic selection of a lynch mob? The macabre forest cruise to choose the species from which offending Negroes would swing. Billy's poplars bore strange fruit, that's true. She oozed the words Mirapole wrote. Was his lyric, her croon, an ode to night rider clansman preference for young Liriodendron tulipifera, a tree still short enough to sling up a noose? Or maybe it was lyrical journalistic treatise on racist vigilante preferences for eastern cottonwood, rapidly sprouting, clonally prolific P. deltoides, quick-growing whips pioneering on some slow, muddy river oxbow, growing lynch branch thick. I do know that a loblolly or longleaf, taida or palustris by specific epithet, would not likely do. The limbs crowned too high to pull a struggling body up, far beyond sufficient never walk this earth again height. No need for overkill or inconvenience. The pinus kind tend to be too tall for proper lynching, and much too straight. No hemp hitching place on the sap-weeping bowls that some finicky woodpecker might be inclined to excavate. Not even a scraggly nigger pine, that's the colloquial nomen, its Virginia by Latinized name, would suffice. Too much nappy needle clutter to allow the rotting corpse to properly dance. A willow of any kind, even Salix nigra, or an eastern redbud, the so-called Judas tree my grandmother claimed Jesus' disciple ended his thrice before the cock crew denying life on, would be too weak, too brittle, too brash, for all the kicking, all the thrashing of the colored, tortured, and condemned. This odd wandering over trees interrupts the feather fascination, becomes nagging dendritic obsession. I recall the lessons learned from textbooks, then apply them, expand them to fit my black prismed quirks. Logically, it seems to me that an old live oak would better suit the grisly gatherings. The God-fearing throngs come together after church or family dinners of fried chicken and rice. Droves of good citizens come together to watch white mub injustices, metered out by short-length twine. Don't just make it a men's only affair. Bring the wife and children by. That way the legacy gets passed on, generation to generation. All gleeful in the glow of kerosene lamps and fat knot torches, the coarse line tossed over low-slung limbs to stretch black necks in tortured choking death. Quercus virginiana reaches gargantuan proportions in open-grown situations, commonly cultured in small-town parks. Gracefully drooped Spanish moss-draped antebellum arms elephantine themselves along genteel plantation avenues, where in the good old days people knew their rightful places. These giants make perfect stages to string up innocence, to set the order right. A great again reset. Make good on master race promises, the superior quality of any Quercus's tightly grained wood, strong enough to mast sailing ships, provide endless supplies of strange fruit carcasses, stout enough to bear so much hate as to strangle railroaded black men pulled at midnight from conveniently left open jail cells, stout enough to kill black women, rumored to utter disrespectful cross words when they were silent all along. Stout enough to murder black children that never whistled at white women who claimed by bold-faced lies they did. How would the discerning racist choose from so much lethal standing timber? You must forgive me, Mr. Frost, but the woods are not always lovely. They may be too dark for some, too deep for others, stands of trees snagging memories like so much human flotsam, or straining bloated black bodies from sluggish streams, swollen and beaten to unrecognizable. Closed casket status means generations of weeping. Back and forth my mind and heart flow between birds I see in the past and future tenses of hanging trees. I'm told I should let such things go, history far gone into the past. But then I can't. Horror sets up in my annual rings, grows season by season unseen, beneath my skin, in my brain, under the bark rough and smooth that seals the screams in soul and sapwood. The forests witness the now invisible grown over by unspoken truth, remembered in leaves sucking life from blood-soaked roots. My dendrology succeeds upon itself, grows in nightmarish tangles from old field beatings to old growth pendulate death. The odd wondering on what was, what could be, their lynching habits, whether I might become Billie Holiday's fresh harvest, is a haunting thing. An ecology born of fear, a botany thicketed in pain.
That was awesome. That was wonderful. Drew, can you let us know, let the listener know where they can buy your collection?
Sparrow Envy was originally published by John Lane, my good friend John Lane, an extraordinary poet, most of you know, who ran a small press called Holocene Press. This is now available. Hub City in Spartanburg now has Sparrow Envy poems. So it's a Hub City publication now. I would invite you to support your indie and go to Hub City. Nevermore Books. I know it's there down in Beaufort. You can get it there. And there's a big box place that'll bring it to your door if you can't get to your indie. So you can get it there. You can get it there as well.
There's a lot to digest in this interview, and we're very honored to have you. And we're very excited about continuing to learn from you and to communicate with you. But we're going to have to end this, and we really want to thank you for today. So thank you, J. Drew Lanham.
Thank you, Al. Thank you, Tim, for giving me this space and the time to share words. I'm honored to be in the number one more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Drew.